B. Collins.
Peter B. Collins, news and comment. It's Monday, April 1st, 2019. I don't know of any April Fool's schemes in this podcast, but who knows? Something just might happen. Well, the Washington Post has been keeping track of Donald Trump's falsehoods, fabrications, deceptions, and lies. And as of the 801st day of his presidency, which I think is today, he has made 9,451 false or misleading claims. And in recent weeks, it's been climbing. They keep track on a daily basis. And on average, he has been pumping out 22 fishy claims a day over the past 200 days, a steep climb from the average of nearly 5.9 false or misleading claims per day in Trump's first year in office. And on Friday, the Angry Don, kind of fueled with even more bravado, ego, hubris, he decided to trash the work of his Homeland Security Secretary, Kirstjen Nielsen, who had announced just last Wednesday that she had agreements with Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras to take efforts to improve the local economies, to tamp down violence in an effort to keep people from fleeing those countries and heading for our southern border. It is the only rational approach. But Don, rational? Who needs rational? So he is trying to throw a temper tantrum. And on the one hand, he says, I'm going to shut down the border. And he doesn't care about the economic impact at San Diego, at El Paso, or other major border crossings. He is determined to be a dictator to these people in other countries and order them to stay home. Do not approach our border. And by cutting a total of $450 million to Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, he is cutting development and humanitarian assistance, also joint law enforcement efforts like anti-gang units vetted by the United States. Now, he hasn't mentioned MS-13 and the menace recently, but that appears to be a high priority for the Donald. And I'm sure that people around him in the White House are pulling out hair, setting it on fire, or whatever metaphor you want to use, saying, come on, Don, this is only going to create the conditions that will force more people to flee these countries and try to rush to our border before you build your frickin' wall. Advocates argue that stopping aid will only aggravate the root causes that drive migrants to leave the countries where a long history of corrupt governments and rigid inequities perpetuate deep poverty. And don't forget, U.S. intervention, Honduras, 2009. Guatemala, 1954, and plenty of time since. And El Salvador, well, that was part of the Reagan operation in Central America in the 1980s. And we never acknowledge that the conditions in these countries are even remotely connected to bad American policies of the past. Now, if it all works out, I'm scheduled to talk to Dan Kovalik tomorrow. He just got back from Venezuela. He wrote the book about how many elections the United States has interfered in, either by meddling or by staging coups. And we'll have a good discussion about that, I am sure. Norman Solomon is a friend of mine from here in California. He ran for Congress, didn't make it. He runs Roots Action along with some other people. And they've launched a new initiative, a petition for you to consider. This week is NATO week in Washington. Last week it was APAC week. And the Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg will address a joint session of Congress, and he will be welcomed by members of both parties. And they will use this to separate themselves from the president in some respects. by staunchly supporting NATO Speaker Pelosi and Majority Leader McConnell, are going to subtly or not so subtly show that they have, unmovable support for NATO, and Trump doesn't. Norman Solomon cites debate on the Senate floor about 2 years ago when Rand Paul said that he didn't want to agree to inviting Montenegro to join NATO. And the late John McCain attacked him. I have no idea why anyone would object to this, except, I will say, if they object, they are now carrying out the desires and ambitions of Vladimir Putin. And I do not say that lightly. When Rand Paul said, I object, McCain said the senator from Kentucky is now working for Vladimir Putin. And Solomon continues with those words. McCain conveyed the common madness of reverence for NATO and the common intolerance for anything that might approach a rational debate on whether it's a good idea to keep expanding an American-led military alliance to, in effect, push Russia into a corner. I encourage you to read this piece. I've linked to it in the show file for today's podcast. And I agree with Norman Solomon. We need a wholesale review of NATO, what its true mission is, other than to isolate Russia. And as Trump has declared his success in forcing NATO members to spend more on their military, I don't consider that a good thing. It only increases the potential for wars based on NATO alliances. And, of course, they're trying to draw Georgia as the next member of NATO, and that is a red line for Putin and Russia. So take a look, and I encourage you to sign the petition if you are so inclined. One of those nations that they attempted to seduce into NATO that led to the partitioning of Ukraine and Russia's annexation of Crimea. Well, Ukraine had an election on Sunday for president. The Candyman, Petro Poroshenko, only got 15.99% of the vote. The leader, as they head to a runoff, is Volodymyr Zelensky, who is a TV actor and comedian. He's 41 years old, no political experience. He, according to this Guardian news account, has largely relied on a wave of anger with Poroshenko and government corruption to carry him into the lead position. He has been vague about his policies. If elected president, he has said broadly he would support Ukraine's integration with the West and would seek peace in the southeast through talks with Russia, but he has avoided debates and held few interviews with journalists. So he's a bit of a cipher. And I don't have the date of the runoff, but that will be looming in short order. Meanwhile, the New York Times is going all out to try to corner Trump into taking aggressive, maybe even military action in Venezuela. David Sanger, he's their Washington bureau chief and a leading light at the New York Times. He wrote that Trump is facing his own red line moment with Putin in Venezuela. For the past week, Trump has escalated its warnings the administration has about Russian intervention in the country, claiming that Moscow is helping to prop up Maduro and undermining the hopes of American officials that the Venezuelan military will oust him. And today, at the Army War College in Pennsylvania, Secretary of State Mike Pompeo said Russia's got to leave Venezuela. Now, with the Mueller report declaring no collusion between Trump and Russia, it would seem that he doesn't have to prove himself, that he's tough on Putin and Russia. He pulled out of the intermediate range, the INF nuclear treaty with Russia, and he has taken some steps that he feels are very tough on Russia. And the Times, in my view, is trying to really put pressure on Trump to show us that he's not Putin's puppet by ratcheting up the isolation of Venezuela and even perhaps conducting a military operation. And because Putin sent 100 military advisors recently into Venezuela, it was John Bolton, not the president, given the task to claim that this is a direct threat to international peace and security with the intent of establishing or expanding military operations. This is how we do it. Look at all those advisors that we have in Syria. You know they're giving great advice, don't you? So Sanger asks, would Venezuela be the place where Trump, who's often seemed willing to tolerate Putin's most audacious provocations, will that be the place where he finally draws his own red line? And Sanger continues, Putin may well see an opportunity to replay Syria in Venezuela, propping up another leader that many American officials said had to go. Now, they do acknowledge that so far the administration has been cautious. They've done the ritual claims that all options are on the table. But Sanger says there's no indication that any military intervention is being seriously contemplated. And that appears to be the reason for this article, to try to fix that. Now, that's not the only play in the New York Times today in what is described as a video op-ed presented by a Venezuelan-American comic criticizing the American left. Now, this Venezuelan American writer and comic is Joanna Hausman. And the New York Times forgot to point out that her papa is the Harvard economist Ricardo Hausman, who is one of the top advisors to the opposition led by Juan Guaido in Venezuela. So let's drop in and listen to a little of Ms. Hausman's op-ed on video at the New York Times today.
There is total chaos in Venezuela. Hunger, lack of medicine, and latest, nearly the whole country had a blackout. But most of the conversation in the States focuses on what Trump is doing about Venezuela, and rumors are spreading that the U.S. is considering military intervention.
All options are open.
This movement on the American left against any U.S. involvement in Venezuela is gaining traction. We've got Noam Chomsky, Roger Waters, Oliver Stone, Boots Riley, Ilhan Omar, AOC, Jill Stein, and Bernie.
Why have you stopped short of calling Maduro of Venezuela a dictator?
Well,
and of course, we've got this lovely guy.
Donald Trump, hands up Venezuela.
It is not a good look when your slogan is co-opted by a tyrannical dictator. Now, Trump usually loves authoritarians, but this time it seems like it's the liberals who are siding with one. Now, I am not a pro-Trump military hawk. For reference, my spirit animal is Ruth Bader Ginsburg in workout clothes. But this movement is dangerously glorifying a brutal dictator and promoting inaction. And that is the...
So you can see she drops in little jokes there like the RBG line. And she says that she's not hawkish herself. But she's criticizing liberals for saying that we have no business intervening in Venezuela. Now, she goes on for another 3 or 4 minutes, and I don't know what else she has to say. But this is a piece of propaganda promoted by the corporate media, trying to rile up Americans about why we should be intervening in Venezuela. I find it very troubling. Now, Maduro has announced in the face of the rolling blackouts the country has experienced the last 3 weeks, and we still don't know the cause, that there is a 30-day plan to ration electricity, and we'll see if that helps ease the pain as they try to rebuild their grid. And, we hear from the Guaido people that there is no sabotage, but frankly, U.S. policy, historically, leads one to be very skeptical that this just happened on its own. And Maduro has relented and agreed to allow the International Red Cross to begin humanitarian aid shipments into Venezuela. And the Red Cross said that its budget will be about double this year, about $60 million, and that they are hoping to begin the shipments very soon. And tomorrow, As I mentioned, Dan Kovalik, who has just returned from Caracas, is scheduled to join us for an in-depth interview. Meanwhile, Trump's, remember right before Christmas, he got all upset and he tweeted that we're pulling all of our troops out of Syria right now. Well, right now has become 2020 at the soonest. The plan is, since the Islamic State is now officially declared vanquished, that we are going to pull out about 1,000 of the alleged 2,000 troops in the country sometime in May. And then we're going to pause for 6 months or so. And when the number of troops reaches 400, half of those will be in a multinational force in the northeast and another 200 at a small outpost in southeastern Syria, where they will seek to counter Iran's influence throughout the country. You know how frickin' big Syria is? Putting 200 troops here and 200 troops there? They are targets. They are not any meaningful form of a military presence. This headline really rankled me. New York Times, Sunday. Gaza protest, mostly calm, ends in death of 3 at fence. The lead, tens of thousands of Palestinians returned to the borderland between Gaza and Israel Saturday for a largely peaceful protest, marking the first anniversary of the weekly demonstrations. And then at the end of the third paragraph, it notes that hundreds of protesters made it to the fence. 3 Palestinians were reported killed. Now, I don't consider that to be mostly calm. And is this more spin in support of Benjamin Netanyahu, the bloodthirsty Israeli who is up for re-election a week from tomorrow? That's the question. I want to once again commend Whitney Webb and Mint Press for breaking a story that I hadn't noticed. In the middle of March, Daily Beast revealed that The Intercept, the online magazine funded by billionaire Pierre Omidyar, and where Glenn Greenwald, Laura Poitras, and Jeremy Scahill are perched with heavy compensation, they have announced that they are going to be shutting down the Snowden archives. Now, we've never learned exactly how many documents or pages were leaked by Ed Snowden from the NSA archives to Greenwald and companions. But many of us have been wary that somewhere around 10% of the Snowden documents have actually been referenced in news articles. We don't know what is in the other 90%. It might be meaningless data, or it might be blockbuster disclosures that The Intercept is not willing to take the heat for. So Laura Poitras, the documentary filmmaker, she did Citizen 4, the profile of Snowden's Odyssey. And she says that she first caught wind of the coming closure of the Snowden archive in early March when Scahill and The Intercept's editor-in-chief Betsy Reed asked to meet with her to talk about the budget process. And during their 2-hour meeting, which Poitras described as tense, she realized they had decided to eliminate the research department, and that's where her part of the work of The Intercept takes place. Poitras later sent 2 emails opposing the closure of the research department and noted that only 1.5% of the total budget for the First Look Media, that's The Intercept's parent company, is related to this so-called research. Poitras quoted here, "Throughout these conversations and email exchanges, there was no mention of shutting down the archive. That wasn't on the table. That decision was made on either Monday, March 11 or Tuesday, March 12th, again without my involvement or consent." And journalist Whitney Webb points out, number 1, Glenn Greenwald and Jeremy Scahill make boatloads of money there. Scahill is making over $300,000 a year, and Glenn Greenwald at one point was making $500,000, $518,000 in 2015. Now, I don't oppose people being paid well, especially coming from a billionaire. But we know that James Risen was hired at The Intercept, and after a video debate with Greenwald kind of went quiet on Russiagate for a period of time. And we also know about Pierre Omidyar, who has been deeply involved with the U.S. Agency for International Development, which many believe to be essentially just a front, the public face of the CIA. And it's speculated here by Tim Shorrock, who is a national security reporter who I know and respect, that under the Obama administration, Omidyar had privileged status. But under Trump, maybe they fear that the Snowden archive is too much of a liability. Every day I pause for a moment to thank the people who support my work here at the Peter B. Collins Podcast with your subscriptions. Fine people like Janet Price, Peter Hoffmeister, Jason Ferguson, and Joey Perillo, the talented actor in Philadelphia. I appreciate them, and I invite you to join them. Visit peterbcollins.com, click on the menu, click on Become a Subscriber on the sign-up page. It's easy to choose the level of support that's comfortable for you. If you want to avoid PayPal, where Pierre Omidyar helped make his fortune, you can communicate with me at my P.O. Box, Box 150, 660, San Rafael, California, 94915. And I've got bonus books. Still have a couple of copies of Trump on the Couch for new annual subscribers with a mailing address in the continental U.S. John Lefrancois is a smart listener who's based in Sacramento. And over the weekend, before the Biden crisis kind of started to surface in the media, he wrote to me. He said, I have a hypothesis. Biden is manipulatively being included in candidate polls, even though he's not running, in order to keep some candidates from reaching the minimum polling requirement for debate eligibility. His inclusion siphons off large numbers of polled voters from other potentially viable candidates. If this rigging is true, then it might also mean that the likelihood of an eventual Biden candidacy is lower than expected, that he is being used only for another pre-debate, DNC-directed circumvention of representative participation. So I think John's question is a good one. And I replied, Hi, John. Biden played this game in 2016, agonizing over a decision that few were pressing him for. His polling is based on name ID mostly, and I think he will stall out if he does enter the race. Joe carries a lot of stinky baggage and few positive achievements, but has a network of establishment Dems who owe him for political reasons, and some conservatives who are afraid of Bernie and all those other entrants. While I don't think the current DNC is captive to Biden like it was to Clinton in 2015 and 16, I'm sure Biden has friends who are trying to use any advantage to help him. I will keep your theory in mind as we watch the melodrama play on. And the mini scandal that has surfaced here is the disclosure by Lucy Flores, a former Nevada legislator who ran for lieutenant governor and then ran for Congress. She lost both of those races. And she accused Biden of inappropriately kissing and touching her in 2014. Now, it's fair to say that Lucy Flores was a Bernie Sanders supporter. It's not clear if she is supporting him in this cycle. And the claim is that Uncle Joe came up behind her before the rally that they were both speaking at. He put his hands on her shoulders and planted a big slow kiss on the back of her head. And in a circumspect way, the New York Times says, Mr. Biden has drawn attention in the past for his intimate touching of political allies, their family members, and even supporters he has just met. Gestures that are seen as excessive to the point of creepy by some, but viewed as harmless by his defenders. Now, I find them creepy, and unfortunately this brings up the precedent of Al Franken. He did stuff that you could call creepy, but he wasn't a sexual criminal. And Joe Biden appears to be doing things that are inappropriate, and I guess we'll have to leave it to voters to judge whether it crosses a line that disqualifies him as a candidate. I can think of many other reasons, and the New York Times ran an excellent article recapping his shifting positions on abortion rights over the years. And based on the polls, that may hurt him, particularly with some female voters. The Times also reported that the Trump administration is diverting $5 million in family planning funds to a nonprofit organization funded by allies of the Roman Catholic Church. This group, a nonprofit based in Southern California, is called the Obria Group. They got an initial grant of $1.7 million, and be very clear, this money used to go to Planned Parenthood for contraception and family planning, not for abortion. But the right-wingers who are picking up this money claim that this is a way of supporting people who oppose abortion rights. Here is Tim Head, president of the Faith and Freedom Coalition. He said the grant was a victory for opponents of abortion rights. Again, the money they got from Planned Parenthood was never designated for abortions. That didn't stop him from saying, for decades, multiple Congresses and presidential administrations, the pro-life movement has fought to at least slow federal tax subsidies for abortion providers, but has failed to do so until now. Not only does this cause First Amendment issues, but these people who claim to be better, superior, more moral because they oppose abortion, they're willing to lie and dissemble to promote their position. Today on Capitol Hill, Tricia Newbold told the House Oversight and Reform Committee that when she worked at the White House, and apparently she still does, she's been there for 18 years, and her job is to vet the security clearance applications of new appointees at the White House. And she says 25 individuals, including 2 senior White House people, I take it that that's Chabanka, were initially denied security clearances, and those decisions were overruled. And it's believed, according to news accounts, that Trump personally overruled the rejection of clearances for Jared Kushner. So, this woman who appears nonpartisan, she worked for both Republican and Democratic administrations, she said, I feel that right now this is my last hope to really bring the integrity back into our office. I think that ship has sailed, Tricia. In Friday's podcast, I reported that Education Secretary and billionaire Betsy DeVos had been thrown under the presidential limousine. Trump went to Grand Rapids, which is the power base of the DeVos family, the Amway fortune. And he overruled her. She had spent 2 days fighting to defend his indefensible budget, which cut off federal funding for the Special Olympics. And as a devoted, loyal appointee who can expect no loyalty from her boss, Betsy DeVos stuck her neck out. He chopped it off, and she turned around, picked herself up, wiped the tire tread prints off after the being thrown under the limo, and she then said that she's glad that Trump had overridden his people and saved the Special Olympics funding. I am pleased and grateful the President and I see eye to eye on this issue and that he has decided to fund our Special Olympics grant. This is funding I have fought for behind the scenes over the last several years. Wow. I mean, this exposes her so nakedly. And yet, she continues to support the man who, well, for whom loyalty is a one-way street. Supreme Court issued a ruling today, 5-4, saying that a death row inmate in Missouri can be executed by lethal injection, even though, because of his medical condition, it will cause excruciating pain. What it means is that they are so bloodthirsty, so determined to execute criminals, that cruel punishment has become usual. And I say that noting the actual language of the Eighth Amendment with which prevents cruel and unusual punishment. And the cruel lead on this is Neil Gorsuch, one of Trump's appointees to the court. He said the Missouri inmate had waited too long to object to the way the state planned to execute him. And he added that the other justices who opposed this were trying to relitigate a February decision concerning a Muslim inmate in Alabama who asked for a delay so that an imam could be present when he got snuffed out. And the court declined that, and they're the right-wing majority, kind of full of itself, even more, based on the Gorsuch decision, quote, "The Eighth Amendment does not guarantee a prisoner a painless death." And he said that the plaintiff, Mr. Bucklew, was required to propose a less painful method of execution, but had failed to do so, and that is a lie. Now, I think it's absurd to demand that a person subject to the death penalty has to provide a court with an alternate method to exterminate him. And in fact, Bucklew's lawyers did propose using nitrogen gas. But Gorsuch said that's not authorized in Missouri. It's never been used to carry out an execution in the U.S., but Justice Breyer, in his dissent, said that 3 states have already authorized the use of nitrogen gas in executions. It's really sordid and flat out disgusting. And finally today, in the county, Gage County, Nebraska, 1985. 6 innocent people were accused of participating in the murder and rape of a 68-year-old woman named Helen Wilson. Those 6 individuals were wrongfully convicted based on false confessions. They were ultimately shown to be innocent and released from prison, and they were awarded $28 million for the wrongful convictions. But the county doesn't have the money. They asked the state of Nebraska for a loan or some sort of a grant, and now they face raising taxes to pay off this big blunder that occurred almost 30 years ago. And here's a guy quoted, Nick Falder, age 25, manages a paint store. He said, "I wasn't even born then, and I'm being expected to pay an extra $3,500 in property taxes to pay for the mistakes of past leaders." That's an interesting conundrum. But in my view, it does not relieve them of their obligation to make things right for those who spent years incarcerated for a crime they didn't commit. Thanks for listening to my daily news and comment podcast. Please share it far and wide. You'll find it on YouTube, and I'm Peter B.
Happy trails to you until we meet again. Happy trails to